In Racing Through Time, we look at the circuits, the drivers, the cars and the races that made motorsport history. Autodromo Nazionale di Monza is the racing circuit that epitomizes Italian motor racing. And the Mille Miglia was Italy's greatest road race. Racing Through Time looks at the classic moments in the history of Monza and the Mille Miglia. The Milan Automobile Club decided to celebrate its 25th anniversary in 1922 by building a permanent circuit. It was to be a location worthy of the Italian Grand Prix and to have facilities to help the Italian motoring industry. The plan called for both a road circuit and a banked circuit suitable for high-speed driving. From the go-ahead on the 15th of May 1922, including delays caused by local environmentalists opposed to digging up Villa Reale for a motoring project, the track was completed in just 110 days. Monza was officially opened on a rainy 3rd of September 1922 with a voiturette class won by Pietro Bordino in a Fiat 501. Since then, it's been the home of Italian motor racing, with both a glorious and sometimes tragic history. The Italian Grand Prix at Monza in 1931. The straights were surfaced with tarmac, while the curves were concrete, and the length of the circuit was 10 kilometres. The central grandstand had 3,000 seats, and 6 side stands had a further 1,000 seats each, built of wood and masonry. Through the 1920s, famous names like Antonio Ascari, Robert Benoit, Louis Chiron and Achille Varzi won the Italian Grand Prix. Alfa Romeo's 2 top drivers in 1931 were Giuseppe Campari and Tazio Nuvolari. Campari was a noted opera singer and was planning to retire from racing so he could concentrate on his singing career. Nuvolari, the Lion of Mantua, was the racer of the time. After his P2 had retired, Nuvolari took over Campari's car. The Grand Prix version of the 8C 2300 was named the Monza after this victory. In 1932, Rudolf Caracciola won in an Alfa P3. A terrible day at Monza in 1933 resulted in the deaths of 3 drivers: Campari and Borzacchini, who crashed on the south curve on oil dropped by another car, and Count Kozłowski. The authorities reacted by introducing chicanes. Caracciola and Fagioli won for Mercedes in 1934 and Hans Stuck for Auto Union in 1935. In 1936, Stuck had a big crash, thrown from his Auto Union after it had ploughed through a chicane, but he was able to walk away. Bernd Rosemeyer scored his 5th victory of the year, and Nuvolari followed him home in 2nd place. The Italian Grand Prix was held at Livorno in 1937, but returned in 1938 to the road circuit at Monza, although the banked track was essentially bypassed. Italy's hero, Tazio Nuvolari, had joined Auto Union. On the 2nd lap, Rudolf Caracciola made a mistake in a chicane and ran into the straw bales. He had to jump out and push the Mercedes clear. His teammates from Brautich, Lang and Seaman all retired with serious engine troubles, and Caracciola's car was running so hot the pedals were burning the soles of his feet. He took it in turns to drive with Van Brautich because he had to finish the race to win the European Championship for the 3rd time. Nuvolari was the delighted winner in front of Nino Farina's Bimotori Alfa and an overheated Caracciola in 3rd. And this was to be the last pre-war Grand Prix at Monza. A military parade with tanks damaged the surface in 1946, and Monza had to be rebuilt. Racing in Italy was underway on street circuits, with Maserati, Alfa and Ferrari leading the way. A huge crowd was at Monza in 1948 to watch the reopening of the track and the blessing of the drivers at the Autodromo Grand Prix. Among those present was Tazio Nuvolari, but he was too ill to take part. Louis Chiron waits for the race. Another veteran, Luigi Fagioli, was to return to racing. The parade of the cars and the flags. The 4 CLT Maseratis and a relaxed Jean-Pierre Vermeulen chats before the start. Count Felice Trossi, with a pipe, about to drive his last race. He died of cancer soon after this event. The Autodromo Grand Prix was dominated by Jean-Pierre Vermeulen in the Alfetta 158. Vermeulen receives the congratulations, and Monza is part of the international racing scene once more. Alberto Ascari, son of the 1920s racer Antonio, won the 1949 European Grand Prix at Monza in a Ferrari 125. The Italian Grand Prix has been an integral part of the World Championship since it began in 1950. With the end-of-season date in September and a late summer feel in the air, the park is truly atmospheric. From the flag, it was a battle between the Alfettas of Nino Farina, Juan Manuel Fangio and Luigi Fagioli, and Ascari's Ferrari. Farina led for 13 laps, Ascari for 2, then Farina again until Ascari had to retire with engine failure. Meanwhile, Fangio retired when his gearbox seized. He took over Taruffi's car, but retired that too. Ascari took over Serafini's car and brought it up to second place ahead of Fagioli's Alfa. So, Nino Farina won the Italian Grand Prix, and with it, the first official Drivers' World Championship in 1950. (1951), and the aging Alfas were trying to keep the rampaging Ferraris at bay. Fangio, Farina and Bonetto had Alfa 159s, now producing over 400 brake horsepower. With a shorter Grand Prix season in the 1950s than now, Monza was the circuit where the World Championship was usually decided, so races here were even more significant. Ferrari had 5 cars for Ascari, Villoresi, Gonzalez and Taruffi, and an earlier model for the Brazilian privateer Chico Landi. In practice, Fangio took pole position ahead of Ascari and Gonzalez. From the start, Ascari, Fangio and Farina fought out the opening laps. Fangio was 34 seconds ahead of Ascari after 12 laps, but lost a tyre tread and the pit stop cost him time to Ascari. De Graffenried retired after 1 lap and Farina after 7, both with engine problems in their Alfas. When Fangio's engine started to sound rough and he retired at half distance, it all seemed over. This was just the sort of challenge that Farina enjoyed. When he took over Bonetto's car, Farina really started racing, carving seconds a lap from Gonzalez's lead, getting within striking distance before his next pit stop. However, all of Farina's good work was lost by an appallingly slow pit stop. He now had 1.5 minutes to catch up. Ascari motored on in his own style. Never as relaxed as Farina or Fangio, he always was quick and neat. Ascari was flustered with this pit stop. General pandemonium, and Ascari left the pits with a refueling hose spraying fuel everywhere. At the end of the race, a tired but happy Ascari took the flag 45 seconds in front of a relieved Gonzalez, with an even more relieved Farina a lap away in third. But one Manuel Fangio emerged as world champion. Before the 1952 season started in earnest, an event occurred which had a great impact on the championship. Fangio, who had raced a BRM at Dundroyd in Ulster on Saturday, flew to London and then Paris, only to discover that flights to Italy had been suspended due to bad weather. So he drove in a borrowed car to Milan overnight, before the days of motorways. He arrived at Monza at 2 p.m. for the Autodromo Grand Prix on the 8th of June 1952. The race was to start at 2:30 and Fangio was exhausted. This was to be the debut of a new Maserati Grand Prix car, the 2-litre A6 GCM, driven by Fangio and Froilan Gonzalez. The World Championship in 1952 was to be held for Formula 2 cars. Ferrari had Ascari, Farina and Taruffi in the 500 model. Fangio started from the back of the grid, but overtook 6 cars on the first lap. He then crashed at the Lesmo curve on lap 2 and was thrown out of the car into the trees. From 1952, the wearing of crash helmets had been made compulsory, and that saved his life. He was taken to hospital on the back of a lorry and treated for concussion and injuries to the vertebrae in his neck. While Fangio was convalescing, the 1952 Italian Grand Prix was won by Alberto Ascari during his record-setting run of 9 consecutive World Championship wins. It was now almost 2 years since Fangio had won a World Championship Grand Prix, and his last chance in 1953 was the Italian Grand Prix. Fangio was determined to do well, but his car had a terrible vibration in practice, and he complained to chief mechanic Bertocci, who told him, "Don't worry, tomorrow, no vibration." The race was a typical Monza slipstreaming battle, the lead constantly changing between Ascari and Farina's Ferraris, and Fangio and Onofre Maramon's Maseratis. On the Parabolica on the last lap, Ascari and Farina were side by side, but Ascari spun, causing chaos. Farina went onto the grass to avoid him, into the path of Maramon, who hit the Ferrari. This was to Fangio's benefit, and with his uncanny ability to thread his way through danger, he came through to win. Fangio took victory by a second from Farina and a very surprised Villoresi. After the race, Fangio's teammate Bonetto said that his car had vibrated so much he thought that his teeth had fallen out, and he couldn't understand it. Fangio, however, knew that his car had been secretly swapped for Bonetto's, who eventually saw the funny side of it. In 1954, the new 2.5-litre formula came into effect, and Maserati had introduced the 250F. But they were preparing 7 cars for the factory drivers and private owners, and this stretched their resources. Lancia had released Ascari and Villoresi to drive other cars, and the Italian Grand Prix was a much better race. Ascari didn't race in the German or Swiss Grand Prix, but was released by Lancia to drive a Ferrari in the Italian race, joining Hawthorne and Gonzalez. He was anxious to prove to the Italian public that he was not a spent force. At this event, Mercedes returned to the track for the first time since 1938. Team manager Alfred Neubauer and designer Rudolf Uhlenhoyt were still in control as the Stuttgart team took a businesslike approach to their racing. Mercedes driver Karl Kling led for 3 laps before spinning, allowing Fangio to go into the lead in the second Mercedes. Then Ascari took over and proceeded to pull away for the next 40 laps. However, he was caught by Luigi Villoresi and Stirling Moss, both in Maserati 250Fs. Notice the paving stones on the track surface, the so-called porphyry paving. Villoresi retired with clutch failure on lap 43, having revved his Maserati to 8,200 RPM, beyond the 7,800 limit. Ascari was passed by Moss, repassed him straight away, but then broke his engine and he was out of the race. The success of Italian racing had generated a passion for the red cars, especially Ferrari, who somehow seemed to capture the racing fans' imagination. Perhaps it was the identification by the public with Enzo Ferrari and his sporting philosophy up against the nationalised Alfa Romeo or the more reserved Maserati. From this period onwards, the vociferous tifosi have been an important part of Italian racing, especially towards the prancing horse of Ferrari. Ascari's retirement left Moss in the lead and heading towards victory in his privately owned car. Sadly, his Maserati's oil tank split and he had to retire with failing oil pressure. Fangio took over in the lead, which he held to the finish to win from Hawthorne and Gonzalez, both in Ferraris. Fangio was world champion for the second time, securing the title driving for both Maserati and Mercedes in 1954. Fangio was joined by rising English star Stirling Moss in 1955. After the Le Mans disaster, the 1955 World Championship finished its shortened season at Monza, the Italian Grand Prix being the final round. And the banked track was back. In 1955, it was decided to rebuild the banking. A complete lap was 10 kilometres long. A loop with 2 banked curves was built, following the 1922 plan, except that the track was set back on the south side to allow for an underpass, and there was an intersection with the road circuit similar to the original one. Mercedes decided that Fangio and Moss should drive the latest versions of the enclosed cars, while Kling and Taruffi had the open ones. Fangio led from start to finish, followed by Moss until his engine failed. Kling also retired, leaving Fangio to win by 0.7 of a second from Piero Taruffi. Fangio was world champion for the third time. Having won, Mercedes withdrew from motor racing. The 1956 World Championship was again to be decided at the Italian Grand Prix and was between the Ferraris of Fangio and Collins and Moss in the Maserati. By this stage of the season, Fangio had argued with the Ferrari team and demanded that they allocate a mechanic purely for his car. The race was again run over the combined road and banked track, which was to prove to be very hard on the Lancia Ferraris, causing constant tyre and steering problems. Musso and Castellotti had their own private race for a few laps until their Engelbert tyres failed and they had to pit, leaving Fangio to battle with Moss and Harry Schell's Vanwall, with Collins in 4th place. Now it was Fangio's turn to have trouble when a steering arm broke. Fangio spent 19 laps in the pits while Luigi Musso ignored pit signals to come in and hand his car over. He refused to do so, even when he did come in for his pit stop. Harry Schell walked in after his Vanwall had retired while in 2nd place. Shortly after, Peter Collins came in to change a tyre, saw Fangio standing there and without being asked, handed over his car. Fangio was overjoyed at the English driver's generosity and resumed the race. Moss had run out of fuel and was pushed to his pit by Maserati privateer Piotti. Musso's steering failed and he slid into the pits and retired. Fangio didn't blame Musso for not handing over his car. The car he should have taken over was Deportago's, but he had already retired. Moss took the win, with Fangio in 2nd place. These points helped Fangio take his 4th World Championship. Peter Collins's generosity was always remembered by Fangio, who remained friendly with the Englishman until his death in 1958. The 1957 Grand Prix was back on the road circuit. Vanwall were after another win following Stirling Moss's victory at Aintree in the British Grand Prix. The British car couldn't handle the bumps of the Nürburgring, but the high speed and smooth Monza was well suited to the Vanwalls. Maserati couldn't match their speed, so Jean Beira was given the experimental V12 250F. It was developed into an easier car to drive than earlier in the season, with a 5-speed gearbox. Vanwall showed their speed in practice and had 3 of the 4 cars on the front row, led by Stuart Lewis-Evans, with Moss and Brooks alongside. Fangio's Maserati completed the front row. Moss led from the start, but was passed by Beira. The lead changed many times, and the furious pace was causing pit stops for tyres and fuel. Tony Brooks was keeping in touch. Lewis-Evans and Beira stopped for fuel and tyres. Stirling Moss was pulling away from Fangio. The Argentinian then stopped for tyres. After showing good pace, Beira's V12 Maserati retired on lap 50 with an overheated engine. Moss was 40 seconds ahead of Fangio. This was the final race for the Lancia Ferraris, but the best they could manage was Wolfgang von Trips in 3rd place. The win to Moss ahead of Fangio. The victory by Vanwall was significant for 2 reasons. It was the first year that an English car had won World Championship Grand Prix, and it was the first win by a company who specifically built only racing cars. Overall, Maserati had defeated Ferrari, and Fangio won his 5th World Championship. After a shocking year for Ferrari, where they lost 4 drivers, the Italian Grand Prix was the second-last round of the championship. After the death of his close friend Peter Collins, Grand Prix racing held little appeal for Mike Hawthorn. His only aim was to win the World Championship and retire. The American sports car driver Phil Hill joined Hawthorn, von Trips and Olivier Gendebien of Ferrari. Vanwall again had Moss, Brooks and Lewis-Evans in their lineup. And Cooper was starting to make their presence felt, but their cars weren't suited to the high-speed Monza track. In a tragic season, Ferrari had lost Eugenio Castellotti, Alfonso de Portago, Luigi Musso and Peter Collins, and Enzo Ferrari was under pressure from the church, the public and the Italian Racing Federation. Hawthorn should have won this race, but again faulty tyre selection and a slipping clutch let him down. Tony Brooks recovered after a pit stop to win again at Monza for Vanwall. Mike Hawthorn did win the 1958 World Championship and duly retired, but died in a road accident in early 1959. Vanwall retired from Grand Prix racing, having won the Constructors' Championship. The front-engine Dino Ferraris were facing the mid-engined Coopers, driven by Jack Brabham and the private Rob Walker entry for Stirling Moss. Lotus were also making an impression. Tony Brooks, now with Ferrari, burnt out the clutch on the start line and watched the race from the pits. Jack Brabham retired from this race, but would end up the world champion for 1959. Stirling Moss and the Cooper outfoxed them all, not stopping for fuel or tyres. Phil Hill did have to make regular stops, so Moss had a comfortable win. Grand Prix racing was changing with the shift from front to rear engines and the rise of the English racing car builders. Ferrari was now the only Italian team, and with no Italian drivers to cheer on, crowd support was even stronger for Ferrari. They alone were upholding Italian prestige. Ferrari's only win in 1960 was at Monza when the British teams opted not to race on the banked track, so Phil Hill emerged victorious. In 1961, all the British teams decided that they would compete on the full 10-kilometre circuit in their even lighter 1.5-litre cars. Throughout the season, Jim Clark and the Lotus had to push hard to keep up with the Ferraris. He made a good start and was amongst two of the four works Ferraris when tragedy struck.
Von Trips went past him on the Vialone curve and unfortunately didn't realise that Clark was running in his slipstream. When they got to the end of the straight, Clark was then alongside trying to outbrake Von Trips, and obviously Von Trips didn't see him. Pulled over, the two cars touched, and the rest, of course, was history.
While Clark was unhurt, Wolfgang von Trips and 14 spectators died in the horrific accident. The full lap was 10 kilometres, so by the time Phil Hill came around on lap 3, much of the debris had been cleared away.
So it's hard enough trying to concentrate on the job at hand in a racing car. When I saw Tripp's car upside down and badly battered, it looked bad, but at the same time I'd seen any number of accidents where drivers had walked away.
Teammates Ricardo Rodriguez, Richie Ginther and Giancarlo Baghetti retired with engine trouble, leaving Hill clearly in the lead. Aware that there had been an accident, but unaware of the seriousness, Phil Hill drove to victory and became the first American to win the World Championship. It was a day he'd never forget.
But when I drove in and saw the face of the chief engineer, Keaty, I knew on an unconscious level then that he was dead. There is no huge emotional shock because you're unconsciously protected from it. The bang of an unexpected death is not there.
Hill finished just 1 point ahead of von Trips, with Moss and Dan Gurney tied for third. In 1962, Graham Hill helped his World Championship aspirations with a BRM 1-2 leading home Richie Ginther. The circuit was now in its fastest configuration. Jim Clark won at Monza on his way to the 1963 world title. After a period of disarray, Ferrari was on an upswing. The Scuderia was led by John Surtees, with the great Italian hope, Lorenzo Bandini, his number 2. The neat and compact 158 characterised Ferrari's mid-60s cars. Monza was always the race where Ferrari engineers unveiled a special engine. This time it was a powerful flat 12, although it wasn't used in the race. John Surtees started from pole, and after a slow start, he was able to catch up, pass, and then pull away from Bruce McLaren's Cooper. Bandini came home third, so it was nearly a perfect result for the Tifosi. Surtees went on to win the World Championship by just 1 point from Graham Hill. By 1965, the last year of the 1.5-litre formula, Graham Hill had a teammate at BRM who was pushing him very hard, Jackie Stewart. BRM's chief engineer, Tony Rudd, remembers.
I think Jackie accepted that Grandpa, as he referred to Graham, was the number one driver. Up until Monza, I never felt that there was a problem, and of course at Monza there was a walloping great problem. There we were, first and second, nobody on the same lap, 23 laps to go, and what do the idiots do? They race each other. And we absolutely got it made, and I gave them the slow down signal, I tried everything, but no, they still did it. And on the last corner of the last lap, Graham went a bit wide trying to get by and went onto the loose stuff and spun. So we had Stewart coming out of the corner first, And about 5 seconds, then Graham appeared. I nearly died. And after the race, of course, we should have been jubilant. Here we are, we'd beaten everybody. First and second again. And there was Graham not speaking to me because he reckoned he was the #1 driver and I hadn't slowed Stewart down so he could pass him. I wasn't speaking to either of them because they'd raced each other. And Stewart couldn't understand what the row was about. So, it's all very difficult.
Lorenzo Bandini scored his one and only Grand Prix win at the best possible place for an Italian driver in 1966. Monza. In 1967, competition between the 3-litre cars was hotting up. Lotus had debuted the DFV engine, Brabham had the title-winning Repco, and there was a new challenge from Japan. Ferrari's 1964 world champion John Surtees now led Honda's assault.
Got together with Eric Broadley and I think it was Tony Southgate. A basic Indianapolis-type chassis was modified and worked on. A lot of the components were made in Japan and flown over, and the whole thing came together just before Monza. The engine was fitted, we trundled off to Monza, and of course, we won the race. Just. Dramatic. It was a dramatic scramble and sort of an outfoxing job on the last corner with Jack Brabham. And we'd have been somewhat fortunate in that Jimmy had been considerably quicker, but he'd run into mechanical problems. And so it was left down to Jack and me to fight it out on the last corner.
For some reason I'd dropped back quite a bit, but I managed to catch him on the last lap and going down the back straight into the corner before the pits. I actually passed him on the inside, and the reason I was able to pass him on the inside, there was oil had been dropped on the inside and somebody had put cement over it, and that left a line down the inside which people were avoiding. That was the only hole I had, and I went down that inside and got in the oil and couldn't quite stop enough for the corner.
Luckily, Jack's actual aggressiveness and competitiveness on this occasion worked against him, and he took the sort of semi-bait that I offered him, because I had the option of going in and blocking his corner by going up the inside line but getting on to the oil, or going down the outside and leaving the inside with the oil and cement on it, and hoping that if he did take the chance that it would mean him getting into a little trouble. And luckily this is what happened, because from the actual exit of the curve up to the start line, Jack was quicker than me. And so if he'd actually sort of really sat tight behind me, he could have pipped me by the start line. But luckily, that open space up the inside was too much of a temptation. And I think perhaps if I'd been in his position, I would have been tempted to do it as well. But it was great encouragement to Hondas, and of course to myself. And the Ferrari had been defeated on its home ground, and by myself. And in fact, I think the Italians just went mad. They were so enthusiastic. It just goes to show, you know, quite how involved the Italians can get with people. And I was extremely heartened to see that they still looked upon me as virtually one of them.
The Monza 1,000-kilometre sports car race was an important round of the World Prototype Championship. In 1970, Porsche had produced a new 5-litre version of the flat 12 engine for the fearsomely fast 917s. Ferrari, on their home ground, sent a team of 4 512s and a strong driver lineup. The Gulf Porsche team was not helped when Joe Siffert went off the road on lap 11, damaging the suspension and dropping out of contention. The Gulf Porsche of Pedro Rodriguez and Leo Kinnunen had to fight off challenges from not only Ferrari, but also the Porsche Salzburg 917 of Elford and Arendts, which made the fastest lap. Mexican legend Pedro Rodriguez.
At Monza, I was running with the 4.5-liter engine against all the 5-liter Ferraris. It was very difficult to keep up with them. And because of that, I was making a very hard race. I made an average speed of 144 miles an hour, and I won the race. But Ferrari came on second, third, and fourth, and it was a very tough one.
In Grand Prix racing, Denny Hulme won in 1968 and Jackie Stewart in 1969, but another of Monza's dark moments occurred during practice for the 1970 Grand Prix. Jochen Rindt was leading the World Championship. Under heavy braking for the Parabolica, Rindt's Lotus 72 snapped left and into a guardrail. He died on the way to hospital and became the only posthumous champion in Grand Prix history. (1971) produced the fastest ever Grand Prix, with an average speed of over 250 kilometers an hour. Peter Gethin won a 5-car slipstreaming race in his BRM. By 1972, chicanes had been installed at the track, and Lotus began a run of success. The chicanes were placed before the fastest curves on the track, the Grande at the end of the grandstand straight, and the Ascari after the overpass. To Colin Chapman's obvious delight, Brazilian Emerson Fittipaldi won the race in his Lotus 72 on the way to the world title. In 1973, mercurial Swede Ronnie Peterson joined Lotus after an impressive season with March. Peterson led home Fittipaldi, and McLaren's Peter Revson was third. Jackie Stewart recovered from an early pit stop to finish fourth and went on to win his third world title. Peterson completed a Lotus treble in 1974 in the now 5-year-old Lotus 72. (1975) Small front tyres, big rear tyres, tall airboxes, and Formula One cars looked like dragsters. A popular Ferrari win to Clay Regazzoni at Monza. Teammate Niki Lauda finished third and secured his first world championship. In 1976, Ronnie Peterson returned to March and scored a victory for the Bicester concern at an average speed of 200 kilometers an hour. The ground effect era was starting, turning the whole car into a wing shape rather than a wedge. Safety was improving, although features like wire fences with wooden poles turned out to be more dangerous than they appeared, cars getting caught in the wire and drivers being hit by the poles. Italian-born American hero Mario Andretti had joined Lotus and stayed with them throughout their pioneering development work with the Lotus 78. He scored an emotional win at Monza in 1977. If a Ferrari can't win the race, then at least a driver with Italian heritage is a worthy victor for the fans. Niki Lauda took second place in the Ferrari, but that was enough to see him secure his second world title. But the Austrian had had enough of Ferrari politics and moved to Bernie Ecclestone's Brabham team. The culmination of Lotus's work with the ground effect Lotus 79 came in a tragic race, and one with eerie parallels to an earlier Monza race. This fiery crash in 1978 cost the life of Ronnie Peterson. He'd returned to Lotus as teammate to Mario Andretti. Peterson was taken to Milan Hospital but died the next day. Vittorio Brambilla only recovered after several months in hospital. Andretti crossed the line first in the restarted race, but he and Gilles Villeneuve, a driver destined to become a real hero with the Tifosi, were penalised for jumping the start. Niki Lauda was awarded the win in the Alfa Romeo-powered Brabham, the final win for that famous marque which had dominated Grand Prix racing 30 years earlier. Just like Phil Hill experienced 17 years before, Monza had cruelly taken a life right at the peak of a team's achievement. Monza continues to play a central part in Grand Prix racing to the present day, with the September race signalling the end of the European season. Touring car, sports car and superbike races have always been popular. This is the Monza round of the European Touring Car Championship of 1986, with Volvos taking on Rovers, BMWs, Ford Sierras and Holdens, but not an Italian car in sight. The Monza 1,000-kilometre sports car race was won by Ferrari in 1972 and 73, but the Maranello team then retired from the Sports Prototype Championship. Victories also went to Alfa Romeo 3 times and Porsche twice. From 1950 onwards, while the Monza track was not being used for races or official practice, it was opened for unrestricted driving by the public for a small fee. In the internal areas, a campground, an Olympic swimming pool and a circular track for model cars was opened. In the large hall under the central grandstand, several motor shows were held. The Autodromo Festival was inaugurated in September 1966. It's held at the same time as the Grand Prix. Apart from 1980, the Italian Grand Prix has been run at Monza every year since 1950. In recent years, there have been minor changes to the circuit, increasing runoff areas and reshaping the chicanes to slow down the cars. Such are the advances in design that Juan Pablo Montoya set the fastest lap ever in Grand Prix qualifying at Monza in 2002 at an average speed of 260 kilometers an hour. While the bank track is crumbling, the facilities have been modernized to keep them up to date. The old Royal Park is still the temple for racing fans from Italy and around the world. Monza is a byword for racing passion. Long may it continue. While Monza continues, the Mille Miglia has long since run its final race. Each year, a historic run brings back cars that competed in the famous road race. Cars like the OM, which won the very first Mille Miglia back in 1927. The Mille Miglia was a continuous town-to-town race, a direct descendant of the great city-to-city races which were the birth of motor racing. From Brescia in the north to Rome in the south and back again, the distance was conveniently 1,000 miles. The course changed little over the years, remaining essentially a big loop. In 1928, Alfa Romeo entered a pair of Vittorio Jano-designed, supercharged 6C 1500s, driven by Campari and Ramponi. Campari drove a fine race and won at an average speed of 80 kilometers an hour. In the great days of Achille Vazzi and Tazio Nuvolari, the only driver to break the Italian domination was Rudolf Caracciola in a Mercedes-Benz. Local knowledge was vitally important. The numbers on the cars represented their starting time, with the first car heading off at 9 p.m. The slowest cars started first, so there was plenty of overtaking out on the road. Maserati and Alfa entered thinly disguised Grand Prix cars as the pace of the Mille Miglia increased. The Mille Miglia was the inspiration of 4 Italian enthusiasts, Count Emo Maggi, Franco Mazzotti, Giovanni Canastrini, and Renzo The Mille Miglia was revived after the Second World War in 1947. Ferrari came to the fore with drivers like the Marzotto brothers. The Scuderia won 8 of the final 10 races, helping establish their reputation as a builder of competitive sports cars. The Mille Miglia was a celebration of Italian motoring, with everything from small Fiat Topolinos to powerful Maseratis. There were interesting characters too. In 1950, Giannino Marzotto swept to victory wearing a double-breasted lounge suit. 1953 was one of the great years for sports car racing. Britain's Jaguar, Healey and Aston Martin challenged the Italians, Lancia, Maserati, Alfa Romeo with the Disco Volante, and Ferrari.
Raised. And off goes a Fiat Topolino. It's nearly 3:40. Time for Venezian to start in his Oscar. By tradition, Castagneto wears the bowler hat he wore to start the first Mille Miglia in 1927. Behind is Stirling Moss in his Jaguar. The team manager of Mercedes, Neubauer, is here just to watch. Beyond Aquila, they climb up to the Sella di Corna. Ravenna, and here's Giannino Marzotto. The Ferrari has broken every record with an average speed of well over 100 miles an hour for the first 180 miles. Rossolini is going steadily, although Tom Cole is about to pass him. He's about 15 minutes behind the leaders. Miles on, Aquila, and the Oscars lead in the 1100 sports car. There's 20 minutes between Venezian's leading Oscar and the Fiat Armini of Brandy. And as Fangio pulls up to the Alfa pits to refuel, another Alfa arrives, clinging his fastest of all by 40 seconds. Alfas are first and second at Rome. All the way, the clouds line the road as we try to steady our camera against the bumps. And here's a lorry. And that's George Abacassis. The Alfa Romeo Fangio leads. Kling is out, and Fangio has taken his place. The fastest car still in the race has now nearly caught up with the Ferrari of Paolo Marzotto, which left Brescia 19 minutes before the Alfa, and is now less than 2 minutes ahead. Paolo Marzotto is now up in third place with his Ferrari. The Alfa Romeo is here. Fangio using all his skill to make up for his lack of intimate knowledge of the roads. Fangio is trying hard, but he won't know if he's going fast enough to hold his 4-minute lead until he arrives at Siena Control. Beyond Florence is the Futa Pass over the Apennines, the last great obstacle before Bologna. And close behind the Lancia comes the Ferrari. The last chance for Giannino Marzotto to use his knowledge of the mountains to gain those 2 vital minutes. Fangio also knows there's not a second to spare if the Alfa is to stay in first place. Bologna, and the Ferrari has broken the record for crossing the Futa, a record that has stood since Biondetti made it in 1938. And it's the Alfa. Fangio's had trouble with the steering and has now dropped 3 minutes behind the Ferrari. And here comes Giannino Marzotto to win the 20th meal.
The fastest ever Mille Miglia was won by Stirling Moss, partnered by Dennis Jenkinson, in the Mercedes 300 SLR. Jenkinson, a motoring journalist, was also a world champion sidecar passenger. They introduced the idea of pace notes, having reconnoitred the roads and made notes of the route on a long roll of paper. In the race, Jenks relayed these to Moss with hand signals so that he was able to take blind corners at higher speeds than would otherwise have been the case. Starting at 7:22 a.m., they charged down the Adriatic coast. They led at Rome and defied conventional wisdom that said that those who led at Rome were never first home. They drove the 1,000 miles in just over 10 hours, an average speed of 100 miles per hour, or 160 kilometers per hour. It was a stupendous effort. The final Mille Miglia was run in 1957, stopped after the death of Fon de Potago, his co-driver Ed Nelson, and 11 spectators. Public road racing was no more, but enthusiasts keep the spirit of the race alive with the Mille Miglia Historica. You can still drive on most of the roads that made up the Mille Miglia to this day, living history in racing through time.